Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be taking a closer look at a topic I know a lot of you have been eager to learn more about, the Eurasian red squirrel and its conservation status.
Yeah, it's a fascinating topic.
Oh, definitely. And we have a great source for this deep dive. It's a scientific review called Red Squirrel, Squirrelus vulgaris, Conservation. Conservation status, threats, and efficacy of conservation measures. So basically, we're going to be diving into all things red squirrel conservation. Now, these little guys are classified as least concern globally,
Right?
but they have been experiencing some serious declines in certain areas. So we'll be uncovering why that's happening, what's being done to help them, and some of the challenges that researchers and conservationists are facing. And there's some pretty surprising stuff in here, too. Like, did you know that a native predator might actually be giving them a helping hand in some areas?
Yeah, it's a pretty interesting twist.
It is. And in some regions, they're making a bit of a comeback, which is great news, but the battle is far from over. So let's not get ahead of ourselves. First things first, let's talk about the red squirrel's range.
Well, it's pretty vast, actually. It stretches all the way from the British Isles eastward to Japan. In fact, this map, Figure 1 from the study, really shows how widespread they are. And they're found in a variety of habitats, too, including coniferous and deciduous forests. So they're pretty adaptable.
That's right. But then you look at Figure 2 and it tells a different story, doesn't it?
Unfortunately, yes.
Especially in the UK and Ireland. Their territory has shrunk dramatically. So what's going on there? What's behind this decline?
Well, a major factor is competition from the eastern gray squirrel.
Right. An invasive species.
Exactly. They outcompete red squirrels for resources, food, nesting sites, that kind of thing. But it's not just about that competition. The real issue is a virus called squirrelpox, or SQPV.
Oh, right. Squirrelpox.
Yeah. Now, gray squirrels carry this virus, but they don't really show any symptoms. But for red squirrels, it's usually fatal.
Yeah, I read in the study that in areas where SQPV is present, red squirrel populations can be replaced by gray squirrels something like 20 times faster.
Yeah.
That's a huge difference.
Yeah, that's a pretty stark statistic, and it really highlights how devastating that virus can be. And here's another concern. Even though squirrelpox hasn't been detected in Italy yet, the gray squirrel population there is growing. And that's got scientists worried because it could potentially pose a threat not just to Italian red squirrels, but to all of continental Europe.
It's like a ticking time bomb.
Yeah, pretty much.
So with all these threats, what are conservationists doing to try to tackle this gray squirrel problem? Because I know the study mentions some pretty intense efforts.
Yeah, well, one of the key things is collaboration. Organizations like Red Squirrels United in the UK and the EC Square Project in Italy are working together, coordinating their conservation strategies. And they're focusing on things like habitat management.
Oh, so like making the habitat more suitable for red squirrels.
Exactly. Making it less suitable for grays, trying to give the reds a bit of an advantage.
It's like giving them a home field advantage.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
But it's not just about creating squirrel-friendly spaces. It's also about understanding, the population dynamics.
Yeah.
So monitoring is super important. You can't manage what you don't measure, right?
Right.
And public awareness campaigns are also crucial. Educating people about how to prevent, unknowingly helping gray squirrels spread.
Yeah, I guess things like reminding people not to feed squirrels in parks where both species are present.
Exactly. It's about understanding how even seemingly harmless actions can have these unintended consequences.
That's true. But sometimes you need to do more, right? Like the study talks about lethal control methods.
Right. Unfortunately, sometimes more direct intervention is needed, and that can involve things like humane trapping and euthanasia. It's not a decision that anyone takes lightly, but it's often necessary to manage the gray squirrel population and give the reds a chance.
So it's a really tough balancing act. But are these efforts, are they making a difference?
Well, the good news is that localized control measures have actually been showing some promise. The study mentions that in certain parts of the UK and Ireland, red squirrel populations are either stable or even increasing.
Really?
Yeah. Figure 4 actually shows an expansion of their range in Northern Ireland, which is really encouraging.
So there's hope, but is it even possible to eradicate gray squirrels on a larger scale?
That's the big question.
Yeah.
The study mentions an attempt in Italy that actually failed, mainly due to opposition from animal rights groups. And it just highlights how complex these issues are, the ethical considerations, the logistics of managing an invasive species on that scale.
Yeah, it's a tough situation.
It is. But there might be a glimmer of hope. There's some research in Ireland that suggests that the native pine marten, which is a predator of both squirrel species.
Hold on, so predator could actually be helping the red squirrels.
Yeah, it seems that way. The gray squirrels are larger and spend more time on the ground, so they're more vulnerable to pine marten predation.
Mm.
And that gives the smaller, more tree-dwelling red squirrels a bit of an advantage.
So it's like the enemy of my enemy is my friend, but in the ecological sense.
Exactly. It's a fascinating example of how complex and interconnected these ecosystems can be.
And speaking of interconnectedness, the study really emphasizes that it's not just the gray squirrels that are causing trouble for red squirrels, right? Habitat loss and fragmentation are major factors too.
Are absolutely. Deforestation, forest fires, even things like pests. The study uses the pine processionary moth as an example. All of these things take a toll on red squirrel habitat.
Yeah, and I imagine it's often a combination of these factors, right, that create this kind of perfect storm. The study also mentions that past afforestation efforts, while well-intentioned, often lack a certain resilience.
Hmm.
So they were trying to plant more trees, but
They were, but the problem was they often planted just one type of tree, creating a monoculture. And while these plantations did provide some habitat for the squirrels, they were very vulnerable to pests and diseases.
it's like putting all your eggs in one basket.
Exactly. But the good news is we're seeing a shift toward more sustainable and resilient forest management practices. The study talks about something called the jigsaw scheme. It focuses on connecting and expanding existing woodland areas, creating a more diverse and interconnected landscape.
And Table 1 actually shows how this approach is much more effective than just, random planting.
That's right.
So it's about creating a healthier forest overall, which benefits not just the red squirrels, but the whole ecosystem.
Exactly. But there's another threat that people might not think about as much, and that's the loss of genetic diversity.
Oh, that sounds complicated. What does that mean for red squirrels?
Well, when populations decline and become isolated, they lose genetic variation. And then think of it like a deck of cards. The smaller the deck, the less variety you have.
Okay, yeah.
And this makes those populations more vulnerable to things like diseases and environmental change. They just don't have the genetic tools to adapt.
So they're playing a very risky game with a limited hand.
That's a good analogy. And this is where habitat fragmentation makes things even worse. It's like having these small decks of cards scattered all over the place, unable to mix and share their genetic cards. So you end up with inbreeding, which weakens the population overall.
So how do you even begin to tackle a problem like that? It sounds pretty daunting.
Well, captive breeding programs play a really crucial role. They're like carefully managed gene banks for red squirrels. Zoos, like the one in Belfast, are working to breed red squirrels and maintain that genetic diversity.
So like a Noah's Ark for red squirrel genes.
That's a great way to put it. These programs are all about safeguarding the genetic future of the species.
And the study mentions some amazing reintroduction programs as well, like the one in Newborough, Wales. They actually used genetic analysis to choose the breeding pairs that they released to make sure that the new population had a good mix of genes.
That's right. It's a great example of how science is informing these conservation efforts.
It's like giving them the best possible genetic toolkit to survive and thrive.
Exactly. And it's not just about creating new populations. They're also translocations, which means moving squirrels from one area to another.
Okay.
And that helps to supplement existing populations and introduce fresh genes into isolated groups.
So like a genetic exchange program for squirrels.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And there's a success story from Belleek Forest Park in Ireland that shows how effective this can be.
So it's amazing to see how all these different approaches are being used to support these red squirrel populations. But the study also talks about the importance of continued monitoring, even after reintroductions or translocations.
Oh, absolutely.
Why is that?
Because genetic monitoring is crucial. It lets us see how these populations are adapting, whether they're maintaining that genetic diversity, if there are any signs of inbreeding.
So it's about making sure that these efforts are actually working in the long run.
Exactly. And speaking of challenges, we've talked a lot about squirrelpox, but the study mentions another virus that's emerging as a concern, adenovirus, or ADV.
Oh, right. Adenovirus. What's the deal with that one?
Well, ADV is tricky. It causes something called autolysis, which basically means the cells self-destruct. And that makes it really difficult to study the virus after an animal has died.
So it's like a disappearing act on a cellular level.
Pretty much.
Uh-huh.
But even though it's challenging, the study really emphasizes the need to develop screening protocols for ADV, especially for things like captive breeding and reintroduction programs.
You don't want to accidentally spread a virus when you're trying to save a species.
Exactly.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground already, from gray squirrels and habitat loss to genetic diversity and disease. It's amazing how much effort goes into protecting these little creatures.
It is.
And before we go any deeper, I think we need to take a quick break. But when we come back, we'll explore some of the other fascinating aspects of red squirrel conservation, so stay tuned. Okay, we're back and ready to dive even deeper into this world of red squirrel conservation. We've talked about the threats from gray squirrels, habitat loss, disease, but the study also highlights something else that's really crucial for their long-term survival, for any species, really genetic diversity.
You're absolutely right. Genetic diversity is key. It's like a safety net for a species. A diverse gene pool helps them adapt to changes in the environment, disease outbreaks, all sorts of challenges.
So it's like having a toolbox full of different tools instead of just a hammer. If all you have is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail.
Exactly. And sadly, in some areas, red squirrels are facing what we call a genetic bottleneck. When populations decline and they become isolated, they start to lose that genetic variation. Think of it like a deck of cards. The smaller the deck, the less variety you have to work with.
Okay, yeah.
And this makes them much more vulnerable. The study talks about the red squirrel population on Anglesey Island as a prime example.
Oh, right. Anglesey Island?
They had a pretty severe population decline, which left them with very low genetic diversity. And habitat fragmentation, like we talked about before, that just makes the problem even worse because it isolates these small populations even further.
So how do conservationists even begin to tackle this? It seems like a pretty daunting task.
Well, captive breeding programs are a big part of the solution. They act like almost like a genetic arc, preserving a diverse range of genes from different red squirrel populations. Zoos like the one in Belfast are doing some really important work in this area.
It's amazing how zoos are playing such a vital role in conservation. So these captive breeding programs are like safeguarding those genes. But how do you actually introduce them back into the wild?
That's where reintroduction programs come in. The study highlights some pretty amazing success stories, like the program in Newborough, Wales. They used genetic analysis to actually select the breeding pairs that they released, to make sure the new population started with a healthy amount of genetic diversity.
It's like giving them a head start in the survival game.
Exactly. It's not just about releasing squirrels, it's about rebuilding a population that's genetically strong, more likely to survive and thrive.
And the study also mentioned something called translocations as a tool for boosting genetic diversity.
Right. Translocations involve moving squirrels from one location to another, and that helps to kind of mix things up genetically, introduce fresh genes into existing populations, especially those that are isolated or have low diversity to begin with.
So it's like a matchmaking service for squirrels, but for a very important scientific purpose.
Exactly. And it's been successful. There's a great example from Ballick Forest Park in Ireland. They translocated red squirrels from a healthy population to an area where the numbers were dwindling, and it really made a positive impact.
It's fascinating to see how these different strategies are all working together to help red squirrels. But the study emphasizes the importance of ongoing monitoring, even after a reintroduction or a translocation.
Oh, absolutely. Ongoing monitoring is key. Genetic monitoring, specifically. It tells us how those populations are adapting, whether they're maintaining that genetic diversity, if there are any signs of inbreeding.
So it's like a checkup to make sure everything is going as planned.
That's a great way to put it.
Well, we've talked a lot about squirrelpox, but the study also brings up another virus, adenovirus, or ADV, as something we need to watch out for.
Right. Adenovirus is definitely a concern.
What makes it so tricky?
Well, for one thing, it's tough to study because it causes what we call autolysis, which essentially means the cells self-destruct. So it's hard to examine the virus after an animal has died.
Wow, so it's like a disappearing act, but on a cellular level.
It makes studying the virus really challenging. But the study emphasizes that it's super important to develop screening protocols for ADV, especially for programs like captive breeding and reintroductions. We want to avoid spreading the virus accidentally while we're trying to help.
That makes perfect sense. We've covered so much ground today, from genetics to diseases, habitat loss, the challenges of conservation, and even some encouraging success stories. But now I want to shift gears a bit and talk about something that's affecting red squirrels in a very different part of the world, Mongolia.
Yeah, that's a good point. The situation in Mongolia is a bit unique. Habitat loss and invasive species are still concerns, of course. But the most immediate threat there is actually unsustainable hunting.
Hunting? Really? Why are they hunting red squirrels in Mongolia?
It's mainly for their fur. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of data on the actual hunting levels and what that means for the red squirrel populations, but the study points to this as a major issue.
So it's kind of a black box in terms of the data.
Yeah, pretty much. And that makes it tough to know how to address the problem effectively.
So more research is definitely needed there.
Absolutely. We need a better understanding of what's happening on the ground before we can develop effective management strategies.
That makes sense. So once we have that data, what can be done to protect the squirrels from hunting?
Well, one approach is to try to promote more sustainable hunting practices, maybe through education programs for hunters, possibly stricter regulations, things like that.
So it's about finding that balance between human activities and conservation.
Exactly. And it's a good reminder that conservation strategies often need to be tailored to the specific challenges of each region. What works in Europe might not work in Mongolia, and vice versa.
That makes sense. It's like finding the right tool for the job.
Exactly. And it just highlights how important it is for researchers and conservationists all over the world to collaborate and share their knowledge and experiences. We can learn so much from each other.
Absolutely. So we've covered a lot of ground today, from genetics and disease to habitat loss and even the challenges of hunting in far-off places. It's clear that red squirrel conservation is a multifaceted global endeavor.
It really is. And it shows us how interconnected we all are. The fate of this little creature, the red squirrel, is actually linked to our own actions and choices no matter where we live in the world.
Well said. But before we wrap things up, I want to circle back to something we talked about earlier, the role of the pine marten in potentially controlling gray squirrel populations. It's such a fascinating example of how ecosystems work. I'd love to hear a bit more about that.
Yeah, it's really intriguing. Researchers in Ireland have observed that in areas where pine martens are present, the gray squirrel populations tend to be lower, while the red squirrel populations remain stable or even increase.
Yeah, so a pine marten is like a natural ally for the red squirrels.
It seems that way. It's not entirely clear why, but there are a few theories. Gray squirrels are larger and spend more time on the ground, which might make them easier targets for pine martens. Red squirrels, on the other hand, are smaller, more agile, and they spend more time up in the trees, so they're less likely to encounter a pine marten.
It's almost like a game of hide and seek, with the reds having a better hiding spot.
Yeah, I like that analogy. And it just highlights how important it is to understand these predator-prey relationships. They can have these cascading effects on the whole ecosystem.
This is such a cool example of how nature can sometimes provide its own solutions.
It is. And it reminds us that sometimes the best approach to conservation is to work with nature, not against it.
So we've explored the many threats facing red squirrels, from invasive species and habitat loss to disease and even climate change. But we've also seen some really inspiring examples of resilience and hope, the success of those reintroduction programs, the potential for natural predator control with the pine marten.
It's a complex story that's always evolving, and there's still so much to learn and discover. But one thing is for sure, the future of the red squirrel depends on us, on our understanding, our actions, our commitment to protecting this web of life that we're all part of.
That's a really powerful message, and it goes beyond just red squirrels. But before we wrap things up completely, there's one final aspect of red squirrel conservation that I think is important to touch on. So we've talked about the science, the threats, and the inspiring efforts to protect these red squirrels, but I think there's another really important layer to this story, the human element.
Yeah, you're right. Conservation isn't just about science and data. It's about people, too. It's about our values, our choices, how we connect with the natural world.
Exactly. And when it comes to red squirrels, there are a lot of different perspectives and opinions. Some people see them as this symbol of wildness, biodiversity, something worth fighting for, while others might see them as a pest, maybe competing with other species or even causing damage.
It's definitely a complex issue, and I think it's really important to acknowledge those different viewpoints, to have those open conversations about what conservation means, what the trade-offs might be.
Like, for example, we were talking about the use of lethal control methods for gray squirrels. That's a decision that always sparks debate, right? Raises a lot of ethical questions.
Yeah, for sure. There are no easy answers. It often comes down to weighing the potential benefits for the red squirrels against the impact on the gray squirrels. Try to find that balance.
It's a reminder that conservation often involves making really tough choices. And it's not just about managing species, it's about managing our own impact on the environment too, right?
Absolutely. Our actions, both individually and collectively, have these ripple effects on ecosystems. Everything from the way we manage our forests to the choices we make as consumers, We all play a role in shaping the future of biodiversity.
It's about recognizing that we're a part of this intricate web of life, not separate from it.
Exactly. And that's why education and awareness are so crucial. The more we understand about how ecosystems work, how interconnected everything is, the better equipped we'll be to make those informed choices.
It's about empowering people to become stewards of the environment,
Yeah.
not just passive observers.
Well said. And that's what I think makes this deep dive so valuable. It's about shedding light on these challenges, but also the opportunities in red squirrel conservation, and hopefully inspiring people to learn more, to get involved, to make a difference, even in small ways.
Well, I think we've achieved that today. We've covered so much: the science, the threats, the conservation efforts, the ethical considerations. We even traveled to Mongolia to understand the unique challenges facing red squirrels there.
Yeah, it's been quite a journey, hasn't it? And I think it's a good reminder that even a creature as small as a red squirrel can teach us so much about the complexities of nature and, our place in it.
So, to our listener, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the world of red squirrel conservation. We hope you've learned something new, maybe gained a new appreciation for these incredible creatures, perhaps even been inspired to take action in your own way.
Remember, every little bit counts. Whether you support a conservation organization, plant a tree, or just talk to your friends and family about what you've learned, you can be part of the solution.
And who knows, maybe someday, thanks to all those collective efforts, those forests will be filled once again with the chatter and the acrobatics of these amazing little red squirrels.
That's a wonderful thought.
Until next time, happy diving.